Hello everyone! Today I'm going to tell you about two books that I've read recently. I'm just going to dive right in without any preamble. One is The Simple Wild by K.A. Tucker, which is about a young woman living with her mom and stepdad in Toronto who finds out that her estranged father, the owner of a charter plane business in the Alaskan bush, has been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Realizing that this might be her last chance to get to know him and to learn why he stopped pursuing a relationship with her, she makes the trip to Alaska to visit him. This book can be categorized as a romance because a lot of it has to do with the enemies to lovers subplot, where a relationship eventually develops between the protagonist and the cranky but ruggedly handsome bush pilot who seems to resent her being there and mocks her apparent shallowness. And I've got to say, I didn't like the main character either for a good 30% of the book. She's not a bad person, but she's pretty ridiculous. But part of the fun of the story is watching her learn from her many mistakes and figure out how life in the bush works and come to love the area and its inhabitants. The character growth is excellent. The real heart and soul of the story, though, lies in the repairing of the relationship between her and her dad. I really liked his character and the way they got to know each other and the way she came to understand him bit by bit. And their conversations, when they finally started having them, were some of the best moments. It's a funny story. It's a sexy story. There's some mature content, not for kids. But it's also a moving story. So much so that there was one chapter that I could hardly read because my eyes were just leaking so much that I could barely see. So, there you go. There is a sequel titled Wild at Heart, I think, and maybe that's good, maybe it isn't, I don't know. I just felt content enough with how this book ended that I don't need to see the characters go through more drama. I can imagine how things play out in the future. I'd rather have it as a standalone book. The other novel I read is one I'm going to spend more time talking about for reasons that I'm sure will become obvious. Mr. R, A Rock and Roll Romance by Tracy Neis, which is a reimagining of Charlotte Brontes' Jane Eyre, with the setting changed to the 70s and 80s music scene and told mainly from Rochester's perspective. This is the cover for the recently released second edition. You might also find it listed with this cover art from the first edition. I am quite fond of Jane Eyre. Those of you who are familiar with the 50-plus videos I've made on the topic are probably thinking, really? You don't say! But Jane Eyre fanfiction is not something I go for. I am perfectly content with the book the way it is, so I have never sought out prequels or sequels. The retellings I have tried to read, I haven't liked at all. However, Tracy Neis came across some of my Jane Eyre videos and contacted me about her book, and though it is my firm policy to not review books at the author's request, I found her pitch intriguing. Plus, I thought those of you who like my Jane Eyre stuff might enjoy hearing about a modern retelling, so I agreed to give it a try, although I did say this isn't really my thing, and she sent me a copy of the ebook. Thank you, Tracy. Warning, the following discussion may contain spoilers for Jane Eyre. The book begins in the early 1970s in Munich, Germany. Eddie Rochester is a guitarist for a British rock and roll band. He meets Roberta, or Bertie Mason, a beautiful woman with a passion for Victorian poetry, something she and Eddie have in common. Despite her brother's hostility and the warnings of friends who think there's something not right about her, Eddie and Bertie pursue a heated relationship. He's inspired to write an album of love songs for her, which becomes a big hit around the same time they get married. The reader is able to pick up on all the warning signs that Eddie, too oblivious and too amorous, keeps missing regarding the true state of Bertie's mental health. When a crisis occurs that leaves Bertie unable to function without supervision, her brother makes a statement to the press that she's dead. Eddie is too upset to correct this statement and instead takes Bertie away to his grandfather's secluded farmhouse in Ohio, where she'll be safely cared for and Eddie will stay with her between tours. The story then jumps forward many years to Eddie driving home to his mansion, which is next to the farmhouse, and almost crashing into a girl on a bike. She turns out to be the new nanny, hired to teach English to Eddie's bandmate's daughter, who he's taking care of while his friend is in rehab. Her name is Jenny Eyre, and almost immediately Eddie is taken with her, which of course creates a problem. When I heard the premise of this book, Jane Eyre set in a rock star's world, I thought, how on earth is that gonna work? But I think the updating of the story works surprisingly well. Jane Eyre is tricky to modernize, because some aspects of it are so entrenched in its historical context. But I think Neis deals with these issues and modifies them in a way that is believable. It helps that there are little details that authenticate the setting and keep the narrative grounded in the contemporary era. Details like descriptions of foreign locations, British slang, occasional German dialogue, lots of pop culture references, and 70s and 80s style conversation. The book's greatest strength, I think, is its characterization of Roberta, or Bertie, who's fleshed out in a way that makes her compelling without turning her into a victim. She is a sensitive, incapacitated woman capable of violence and destruction, but not completely out of her mind, and it's sad to see her struggle to communicate while those around her more or less treat her like a child. Eddie, in particular, can't ever seem to understand what she's trying to say, but the reader can figure it out and gets frustrated with her when he's like, "Oh, you want some strawberries? Okay, I'll ask Grace to get you some, but they might not have any at the store because they're out of season," when that's not what she was saying at all. What she was saying was relevant to the conversation that they were all having. She was trying to participate. She's showing that she is alert, that she is listening, and that she's trying to connect with him, and he's just totally missing it. Ugh. The situation is such that I ended up feeling more sympathy for her than for Eddie or for Jenny, and for a long time I was actually not rooting for them to get together. And by a long time, I mean right up to the last chapter or two. Outside of some basic biographical info, I didn't think Jenny had very much in common with Charlotte Bronte's main character. She also seems much younger than Jane, even though technically she's older. Speaking of ages, Eddie meets 19, almost 20-year-old Jenny on his 45th birthday. That is a wider age gap than was in the original novel, and it felt even bigger to me because Jenny talks and acts in a way that reminded me of a high school student. The fact that Eddie has to keep insisting that she isn't underage when people criticize his behavior doesn't dispel that notion. So I felt a little squicky about it. In the Victorian era, age disparity in couples was relatively normal, although even that had its limits. Plus, young people then seemed to grow up faster than they do these days. So, 18-year-old Jane would be more mature than 19-year-old Jenny. Essentially, what wasn't so unusual in Charlotte Bronte's time really sticks out in a contemporary setting. That's one of those issues you have to deal with when you attempt to modernize Jane Eyre. I also didn't quite feel that Eddie and Jenny were on an equal footing intellectually, which I've mentioned before is something I really enjoy about the original relationship. So, this was a tough hurdle for me. It would have been easier to overlook the age difference if Jenny didn't seem so immature and if her youth wasn't referenced so often. Eddie did a lot of things that bugged me too, especially that he would spend time with Bertie, cuddling with her and being an affectionate husband, and then he'd trot off to be with Jenny as if Bertie was totally unaware. I found it very difficult to forgive him for this, and it made the whole deception seem worse, I thought, than it was in Bronte's novel, where Rochester and Bertha were clearly estranged and had been almost from the beginning. I also need to mention that this is a fairly explicit novel in terms of language and innuendo and sexual content, right from the beginning. It's quite descriptive when it comes to Eddie's activities, and since most of the book is told from his perspective, you're made very aware of how physical his attraction to Jenny is. It was more descriptive than I'm comfortable with, so if you're interested in reading the book, you might want to take that into consideration. So those are my thoughts on Mr. R. I still feel that Jane Eyre retellings probably just aren't my cup of tea, but it's an interesting and creative take on the classic. Neis uses the framework of the original novel to make her own story with her own characters. The echoes of Jane Eyre are there, especially in certain scenes, to testify of the author's love for the Bronte book, but it's far enough removed to stand on its own, and even include some unexpected twists. It's actually the first of a series, which she's called the Rock and Roll Bronte series. The second is Restless Spirits, Neis's take on both Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, including characters featured in Mr. R, and she's working on a third book inspired by the tenant of Wildfell Hall, titled Wildfell Summer. Speaking of Wuthering Heights, I am finally assembling my thoughts on that topic for a much requested video. I reread the book a few weeks ago in preparation, and I'm gradually organizing my complicated feelings, so look for that video sometime in March. Anyway, I've gotta go. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any thoughts on either of the books that I talked about, please leave them in the comments below, and I will see you next time with another review. Thanks for watching.